Video games are potentially the most complicated form of electronic media. Unlike books and films, games have more attributes to incorporate. This includes visuals, audio, narrative, and interactivity. It's how this type of media is generally reviewed, and is arguably what makes them so popular to critics and inquisitors. Large open-world experiences in particular are heavily anticipated due to integrating several of the aforementioned attributes. Those that hit the mark are regarded as some of the greatest games in the medium. The level of intricacy provided in games has led to numerous discussion about the future of player interactivity. With the booming evolution of computer chips and VR equipment, there's an endless amount of speculation on what the next step will be for the games industry. But is an increase in technicality truly the driving force for next generation interactivity? Despite the large potential for interweaving enhancements to these attributes, very few big budget games actually attempt this combination, more often downplaying gameplay mechanics to emphasize the visuals in a vain attempt to emulate cinema, or to tuck away narrative to make away for repetitive gameplay objectives. Because even though sports and board games have existed for millennia, gamers will still insist that gameplay is solely unique to video games. And even when titles try to incorporate visuals, audio, narrative, and interactivity into their core experience, they still tend to fall short in some other way, which is to be expected. Making video games is difficult, and a part of that is because they're multifaceted. And as the bar for technology increases, so too does the player's expectations of what should be capable. Online discussions hyping up and fantasizing about graphically dense environments, multi-branching stories with deep personalities, complex combat systems, dynamic soundtracks, all these possibilities. But then the big dog gets released and half the game doesn't even work. With each passing year, it becomes too difficult for developers to catch up to the growing technology and their player base's expectations, unless you're Nintendo. Perhaps advancing interactivity would require something more realistic than expecting humans to catch up to the intricacy of their own hardware. Could there already be a solution for changing the way we engage with video games? Does it have anything to do with Metal Gear Solid 2? I don't know, but on an unrelated note, let's talk about Metal Gear. Released in mid-1987, Metal Gear was a basic action-adventure, but was still ambitious at the time. It was created on the MSX2, which I will henceforth be referring to as the MAN6-2. The most notable aspect about the game was the emphasis on stealth. Approaching enemies head-on would cause several of them to gank up on you, and only your melee attack was capable of dropping extra rations and ammo, advising players to get close behind enemies and play passive. But stealth elements in games weren't much of a new concept either. Even Zelda had you fighting enemies out of sight. Though one thing that was particularly interesting was the level progression and the setting. The main character Snake was sent on an infiltration without any equipment, so you'll be navigating through the military base to acquire weapons and tools to access new areas. There's a decent variety of tools as well, ranging from plastic explosives, a parachute, night vision goggles, and even remote-controlled missiles, also known as the Nikito. Of course, the game also has its fair share of 8-bit insanity. Supposedly, the wind on this roof is so harsh that it can impede progress. This chug jug of antidote is essential to avoid the toxins injected by the army of scorpions just outside the building. The worst part about this game is when you're required to obtain the oxygen tank, then backtrack all the way to this elevator, swim up this sewer to kill Dirty Duck, obtain his keycard, then travel all the way back to unlock a single door. This padding is so stupidly obtrusive that it feels more like the developer's joke. Why did Snake even need an oxygen tank? Because he didn't know how to swim? He seemed fine in the game's introduction. Did Fire Trooper burn his brain cells? Or could it have been Shoot Gunner? The game's setting has a bit more going on, revolving around the titular Metal Gear, a bipedal tank that can be equipped with nuclear warheads. There's also a bunch of hostages to be rescued that provide more intel about the situation, like Grey Fox here, who was sent here to investigate before you arrived. Some more vital information include which ladder to take upon escaping the base, and the specific order to place explosives on Metal Gear. Towards the end of the game, your commanding officer, Big Boss, starts providing strange false advice that potentially gets Snake killed. He even starts to get real meta at one point, like he tells you to turn off the system because the mission was a failure. Turns out Big Boss was the big bad boss all along somehow, and so you fire rockets at him, and he dies. Then the base blows up with Snake walking behind, which is real classic. No big deal. Job done. That's all. No big deal. Metal Gear definitely has its rough edges, but when looked at in its entirety, there's something here that's bigger than the sum of its parts, homing in on that tactical espionage experience of infiltrating into an enemy base, uncovering the truth of the operation, and saving the world from potential nuclear annihilation. A mutual basis that would go on to be shared by the rest of the franchise. When put in this way, the game follows a very common appeal. One of the major reasons people play video games is to provide escape from reality, and fantasize about being a super cool guy taking on an imposing threat, which was the aspect that was often praised at the time, along with the graphics, and as such the game sold very well, allowing the demand for a sequel. The director of the game, Hideo Kojima, was brought in partway through development and was largely responsible for the emphasis to shift into stealth-based game design, as the game was previously intended to be more action-focused, but with the first entry's success, Kojima bumped up enough street cred to warrant directing the next project in the series from the ground up, encouraged further by the company to create an authentic wargame, to the extent that the development team would hike the mountains to do some military roleplay, supposedly even hiring a former Green Beret to assist with the game's realism. So, just how ambitious was the second take? Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake is where things start to get interesting, leaning furthermore into the stealth experience, allowing for a further breadth of ways to interact with the game world. Big Boss returns after his rocket breakfast and assembles the new Zanzibar land, an independent state that seeks military dominance against the rest of the world, along with the amended Metal Gear D and a recently discovered energy source known as Oilix? What are these names? On this new adventure, you're given a new arsenal to work with. In the top right corner of the screen, you have your radar, in a 3x3 grid that allows you to see enemy surroundings. It's real useful and is even used for some story segments later on. There's also the newly added crawl. Yes, that's right, Snake learnt how to crawl between games. And that's not all, he also learnt how to swim. There's also a nice little detail with the multiple rations you could obtain, as they each have unique food descriptions. You got steak, you got cheese. These aren't just words for flavor text, they also have gameplay ramifications, like how chocolate in the rations can absorb acid, because of course they do, it's more realistic. Sometimes your pals on the codec would have to change their numbers every so often to avoid enemy interference. There's a bunch of relationships going on too. You got this ninja, you have this scientist guy called Kino Marv. One of the more prominent conversations in the game is with Gustava, where Snake immediately recognizes that she is an Olympic figure skater on site. It's a pretty deep convo, and, you know, she ends up dying immediately after. But the enemy is also packing their own arsenal. Big Boss's Big Boy Beluga has its own tricks up its sleeve, preparing some dastardly traps to prevent anyone from infiltrating, like this green boy assigned to walk around in circles in the jungle for 10 real-time minutes. You see, Big Boss also made sure to import squeaky sand from Okinawa to prevent people from sneaking around in the desert. This new floor technology may as well be used for the new boss fight as well. Let's not forget about the Running Man, who, runs in a square. I guess he was too fast. But you know, Big Boss doesn't just recruit evil people, he also allows children to roam around his base, even in the sewers. Because, you know, Big Boss is such a nice guy, really taking in all the orphans, you know? Just make sure you don't shoot them by accident. The sewer is also home to some rapid currents. As we all know, Zanzibar is known for its underground water streams that move at 250 miles per hour. There's also this puzzle in the game. You would basically grab an egg from a nearby building, and then wait for it to hatch into an owl, then have the owl hoot, then make the guard turn off the barrier because he thinks it's nighttime, and that's how you progress. Just make sure you don't pick up the snake egg. It's like an older, stupider version of the Ocarina of Time chicken section, and I love it. Big Boss is also a man of the holidays, so the national anthem in Zanzibar land is Merry Christmas. The finale of this game is classic stuff. You have this other scientist guy that puts you in a chokehold, then you gotta sneak under this wardrobe and use cheese to lure out the venomous hamsters native to Zanzibar land, and we're assigned to guard this man-6. You then fall down and fight Grey Fox in a Metal Gear. Yes, that Grey Fox. The mech blows up, burning all your equipment, and then you proceed to have a minefield fist battle to the death. And then you are greeted by him. Look, it's Big Boss! Big Boss isn't just gonna kill you on sight, he's gonna chase you down with a machine gun while you run into different rooms and, you know, maybe occasionally get burned alive by the acid, and eventually you burn him to death. And so, you save the day and ride away on your helicopter. But not before checking the Man-6 cartridge you had. Wait, you're telling me Kyo Marv was VRAM OK backwards all along? I guess he really was a gamer. To conclude, Metal Gear 2 is a very fun game, and it really tries to amp up the realistic gameplay and add more complicated story. So, what's next for Metal Gear? I'm sure most of you already know. Metal Gear Solid is a landmark title, not just for the PlayStation or the stealth genre, but gaming as a whole. Snake returns for his third mission to prevent another revision of Metal Gear from launching yet another nuclear missile, except this time there's much more powerful hardware to enhance the experience even further, specifically thanks to the full 3D environments and voice acting. The additional dimension can change the way you perceive things, like looking through the slits in these vents to see early glimpses of the next room you're about to enter. These infrared lasers can bob up and down without having to rely on depth perception, thanks to the first-person view that can be toggled on. This sniper battle is able to make use of switching between axes, positioning on the X and Y while aiming on the X and Z, a technique that gaming would eventually catch up to. Meanwhile, the tank boss tests all three axes when attempting to throw grenades down the enemy's chute, skedazzling around these bombshells and mines. Real epic. The Metal Gear itself, codename Rex, seems bigger than it ever has before. The 3D environment naturally allows for more space to be taken up in the game world. Watching Snake climb around the behemoth in the final acts is like watching a Zanzibar hamster crawl through a labyrinth. Then the boss fight starts and the camera is zoomed out so you get this grand imposing shot with the machine towering over you and roaring a battle cry. Cinematography actually exists now. Gotta zoom in on those chunky polygons, or do a little wish whoosh here and there. Check these far out shots that pan over the facility to establish the setting, and when a character starts to go Freddy Freaker, the camera hits you up with the teleportation technique. These fancy visuals are assisted with the new voice acting.
Type of stimulant. It'll keep you alert and responsive for 12 straight hours.
That was quite a cocktail.
Characters were witty back in Gear 2, but to hear some of their sick banter in the game itself is a true blessing, like all this talk about muktuk.
Must be a real threat in the muktuk eating contest.
Yes, you are right.
What would otherwise be an uncanny potato gathering is given a humanizing vocal leg up. It helps that the game has kept its sense of humour despite the grim situation. Otacon in general is just a real fun, dorky addition that grows a lot later on.
I thought you might be hungry.
Another addition that voice acting brings is accents. The MGS games tend to incorporate characters from many different backgrounds, making this another area that would prove advantageous to the inclusion of vocal performance.
Don't get too greedy or you might be sorry.
Characters like Sniper Wolf and Vulcan Raven came from rough backgrounds much like Gustava, adding weight to their performances.
I was born on the battlefield, raised on the battlefield. Gunfire, sirens, and screams. They were my lullabies. Hunted like dogs, day after day. Driven from our ragged shelters. That was my life.
Snake! What was she fighting for? What am I fighting for? What are you fighting for?
If we make it through this, I'll tell you.
Okay.
There weren't any torture sequences in the previous game, but thanks to the voice acting, you can now witness the true CBT experience.
We're not finished yet.
Combining these additions together, and you have a game that starts to feel like a movie at times. And a lot of that was intentional. After all, Kojima was a big fan of movies, and wanted to be a director previously. The cutscenes were greatly enhanced and no longer bound to codec screen conversations. Though there is still plenty of that, they're at least accompanied by voice acting, and even auto-advance in sync with the dialogue. But when comparing the game to Metal Gear 2, most of the gameplay and scenarios are around the same. Like this elevator ambush with the 4 Horsemen of Apocalypse. Don't forget the attack of the enhanced ninja in the office space. That's 900 per month on Zoopla. Remember the temperature keys and going into hot and cold areas in order to access the next area of the game? Except this time it's just a card key. It doesn't melt in real time. How about infiltrating the woman's locker room? Or how about climbing up these overly elongated square staircases as enemies chase after you? All of your equipment being burnt down and having a one-on-one showdown with your bro. Except this time it's shirtless. But I think the best comparison to make is with the Hind D fight. Both games have you face off against a helicopter, but there's a real difference in the way you experience it. In Metal Gear 2 it's just run away and shoot missiles off screen, but in Metal Gear Solid it's much more cinematic. You actually get to fight a helicopter on the same screen. On top of that, your brother is also taunting you in real time. And when you shoot him with a missile, he goes, "Arrgh!" That takes care of the cremation. Grey Fox also returns, but this time is even more unhinged than ever before. Now transformed into a cyborg, banging his head on the floor and terrorizing the otakus.
It's like one of my Japanese animes.
He also saves you at one point? But I think they gave him a great send-off here, battling toe-to-toe with Metal Gear as the music begins to swell to a climax.
Now, in front of you, I can finally die. After Zanzibar, I was taken from the battle, neither truly alive nor truly dead. An undying shadow in a world of light. But soon, it will finally end.
After living his entire life on the battlefield, I think this was a very fitting end for both the character and the Metal Gear series, to then transition into the Solid games. They even gave him a sister who gets very angry with you throughout the
You have
game.
the genes of a soldier, not a savior.
I haven't even gotten to Psycho Mantis. To put it simply, Metal Gear Solid is solid. Not super perfect or anything, like a comfort action flick. It's even got this cheesy snow sled ending, where they ride off into the sunset. But if you were to look at these 3 games, they aren't anything special, but do make up for some rather fun games, and a nice demonstration in the progression of the game's medium. But Metal Gear wasn't unique in this regard. Plenty of game series have gone through a similar evolutionary process. PlayStation games in particular tend to push 3D graphics and vocal performance to amp up the presentation. Usually game series would cap out at this point. After all, games are often defined by these 4 attributes. Now it becomes a matter of how to polish further beyond, and that's not inherently a bad thing. If anything, it's expected. But going back to Metal Gear, Kojima already got what he wanted with the movie presentation. The problem was, what was next? More graphics? More dynamic sound? More narrative and lore? More ways to interact? To make a sequel that expands on these aspects would be easy, and obvious. With the new popularity comes more resources and manpower on board with the game's success. When discussing video games, although they're certainly more complex than any other medium, they are still limited to the confines of fiction. So how do you go beyond that? How do you go beyond a video game? Before the release of the next game, there was already a ton of hype for the next Metal Gear. During E3 2000, it showed off an impressive trailer showing all the cool graphical and technical details that the new game would offer on the recent PlayStation 2. Magazines were calling out for being the most anticipated game on the PlayStation. You got to see all kinds of things like watermelons exploding and explosion particle effects. Got to see those facial animations. Tons of people were already on board for Snake's next mission. Look at all that water. And then, the game came out. We finally made it to Metal Gear Solid 2. Released November 2001, We've come 14 years since the release of Metal Gear 1. So how does this continuation pan out? This mission takes place on an oil tanker riding along the Hudson River, the ship being a cover-up for the newest Metal Gear Ray model, an amphibious mech equipped with a hydro cannon and thick thighs. It's up to Snake and the returning bad boy Otacon to sneak in and expose the enemy's plans on Twitter. It's during this segment of the game that we get to see what this new generation of hardware can provide to an already fleshed out game series. Graphical details alone were enough to get the gamer-goons on the moon. All these rain droplets, explosion effects, glass shards from broken bottles to torn pages of magazines. Even this guy's fleas were working off some techno magic. All these particle effects are certainly a glow-up from Shadow's shallow snow show. This ice bucket in particular was infamous. Knock it over and watch the cubed hydroxide melt away in real time. This is still impressive even by modern game standards. Check out this specific TV screen for an early preview of the model you're after. Hit up your boy Otacon for some cool commentary.
Look at the TV.
There's lots of cool Easter eggs like this that add up to create what feels like a more realistic experience. That illusion that the tanker is a real place, with the consistency of its layout and the significance of each object. Like how you can position Snake in a particular way next to this poster, and this increased level of features wasn't just all for show though. Like in true Metal Gear fashion, some of these innocuous details can change the way you interact with the game. The light sources are a dynamic vision tool that can give away the enemy's or player's location, depending on where they're standing. Shoot the light bulb to remove the visual sense for both parties, or even disable them altogether. To hold enemies up at gunpoint seems like a fun little effect, but if you look closely at their chest, or use thermal goggles, you can notice a dog tag which can be forced off of them along with the extra items. Each soldier has their own name, and collecting them unlocks bonus content which incentivizes completionism to pursue enemies in this sneaky manner. Z-axis maneuverability was also granted with the overlooked grip mechanic, giving access to new hiding spots and ways of traversal, including one of the multiple ways to discover Ray.
Metal Gear.
This assembly hall is a great showcase for the game's audio. To be able to fit in a whole 7-minute speech, and still have segments where the guards would look in multiple directions in accordance to the commander. The floorboards from Metal Gear 2 make a comeback to catch you out. Or you could just play bowling. Otacon himself has lots of different commentary depending on what you snap photos of.
I can't believe you took a picture of her, all things considered.
Narratively, this segment is similar to the previous 3 games. Infiltrate the metal building, and clap that metal thigh. Though the sheer breadth of unique codec conversations and methods of interacting with the enemy base adds much more character in comparison to other bases throughout the series. There's a lot to be excited about if you're hot off the previous game.
Utterance of the syllable when people are at a loss for words. A kind of vestigial.
Hey! Ah! What a crock! What did you do with that little cheat sheet I made you? Oh, there it is. Hey!
Snake makes a dashing, electrifying introduction where his stealth camouflage short circuits. That's literally what the electric is, by the way. Not very efficient for a trained killer, but I guess it looks cool. It's also not very efficient to waste one of your bullets at the beginning of the mission. But here's a cool trick. If you skip the demonstration, you actually get to keep the bullet that Snake would have shot. What an interesting little detail. I'm sure no one will write a 3-paragraph article about the significance this has on establishing the role of the player or anything meta like that. That's not all the crazy stuff either. Revolver Ocelot shows up again, being mined and hand-controlled by the previous game's antagonist, and then proceeds to hijack the Metal Gear Ray, and the rest is classic.
Snake!
Dang, what an opening act. If that was the entire video game, then Solid 2 would have already been considered as one of the best games ever created. I mean, technically it already was. This tanker segment had everything the medium could ask for. Meticulously detailed environments, tons of voiced character interaction, and some of the best particle effects of the console generation. For a brief 1 to 2 hours, the game delivered on what fans were expecting for a new Metal Gear game. All the best aspects were back, and Kojima was god. But if you watched this video up until now, you may already know where I'm going with this. This tank episode was only a fraction of the main game, and it's this shift that really made things interesting, where the meta in Metal Gear transformed into something more than real.
This is Snake. I'm now inside Strut A of Shell 1.
No! That is not Solid Snake!
Raiden is this game's protagonist. And yet, he's introduced as Snake. For the first time in the series, minus the omissions, we're playing as a character other than Snake, but is labelled as him anyway. This is the beginning of what I'm going to call gamerization, or I guess you can call it a form of postmodernism, even though my word is cooler. The idea here is that the game makes reference to or questions their own existence, usually in a very self-reflective manner. In the context of the game, using Snake as a codename just seems like an agent tag kind of deal. We already know there's something wrong the moment the character begins to speak.
What's their stake in this one?
But who is Snake? If Snake simply refers to the main character of the Metal Gear series, then here he is, with his beautiful blonde hair and pecs. But Snake doesn't have blonde hair! Are you so sure about that? And if this is Snake, then who's this guy? Oh yeah, right, he's just Pliskin. He looks kinda familiar though. This is one of the many examples that showcases the reflective criticism lampshaded towards the gaming community.
That man was the real Snake all along.
Maybe.
Maybe.
A lot of people were peed off at the time, since Raiden didn't look as cool as the real Snake, because Snake was always such a cool guy with his lung cancer that prevented him from holding his breath underwater. It's so cool how he went from 7 pixels to 7 polygons, because he's such a cool character with his cool moves and his cool... Okay, I'll stop. Snake was beloved by try-hard gamers, since they wanted someone to roleplay as, so to have this hermaphrodite show up and be proclaimed as Snake, it was meant to hit a nerve, especially if that character was a gamer themselves.
Sneaking mission 60, weapons 80, advanced...
He even drinks the certified gamer juice. Urine. This game really nailed defecating on the player character. You get nagged for performing atrocities, shoot this tiny square or die. They make you backtrack a lot while Raiden cries about how he's not good enough. This vampire styles on you. This fat man on roller skates styles on you. Real Snakes gets to go on the spinny helicopter ride while you suffer in Tube World. Women exist. Makes you watch this cutscene where you didn't actually kill the vampire. Rescue the president. Inappropriately assaulted by the president. Local friendly cybernetic ninja that isn't Grey Fox reveals your next location, because Frank is still dead. You're Ames. You're a grunt. You're special. You're an idiot who got baited by a stationary ration. Jack, do you remember what day it is tomorrow? Then they make you do both an underwater segment and an escort mission at the same time. You have to babysit this stupid otaku who puts wood in her hair, while you're forced to watch her very slowly walk across as she insults your hair.
But I got my own ideas about that hair. I wonder if it's...
Even Diarrhea Johnny has more game than you, and after all that, she gets killed off anyway. None of these things are difficult or upsetting, especially when you're aware of this type of meta-narrative. But sadly, people who played the game at the time seem to have lacked the self-awareness to enjoy this Kojima-level humour, because when I watch this cutscene mourning over the character, then does a bad boy gangster roll up with a parrot on his shoulder, you are now also dying of laughter. That's not to say there aren't nuggets of genuinely nice moments, like Raiden and Rose reminiscing on how they met.
We went our separate ways from the museum, and then I found you again by coincidence out in the base corridor.
An amazing coincidence that we were actually working at the same place.
That night we went up to the top of the Empire State.
It was so beautiful. I could look down on the Chrysler building from 120 stories above ground.
I felt overwhelmed. I didn't care anymore who was right.
And that was our first date.
We watched King Kong in your apartment a bunch of times that night. Didn't sleep till morning. If it weren't for that coincidence, we wouldn't be together.
I know.
All the stuff I praised in the tanker section applies here too. Honestly, this video would need another half hour to go over all those details here. The meticulous heart of the Metal Gear series is beating all over this game, but it noticeably has a layer of postmodernism to present all sorts of questions about what we like and dislike in games, and our limits for these repetitive aspects. We're reaching the ending of the game now, and this part right here really pushes Raiden to his limits. Losing all his equipment and finding out his girlfriend was working for the government to spy on him. And of course there's this iconic freaky section.
Infiltrate the enemy fortress, Outer Heaven. Destroy the final weapon, Metal Gear.
And we briefly get this adrenaline rush, taking down soldiers and even entire Metal Gear Ray models. maybe even 25 if you're European. Snake was only able to take on 3 of these Metal Gears solo. Well, 2.5. Maybe 1.5. I guess it was Raiden who was the cool guy after all. So cool! But eventually they get captured and Solid 2 really starts to show its full hand. The main antagonist, Solidus, has been seemingly all over the place in his motives. He wanted money? No, he wanted to launch a nuke. Nope, he just wanted to get back at the government that set him up, and give liberty to all the citizens in his country. This isn't inherently a villainous motivation, but is made morally questionable knowing he trained child soldiers. The previous game's antagonist was going on about genes, but here we're talking memes. Like, real memes. To pass on our legacy and what we've learned. It's ironically appropriate that the supposed ultimate replica of Big Boss is the game's final hurdle. He's named Snake like the previous protagonists, and wants to pass down his ideals, and yet you, as the player, are the one on the opposing side. The whole game turns out to be a simulation for the events of the first game, and even society itself, which eerily mirrors the desires and compliments that were received all the way back at the E3 demo, and goes back to what I said about Snake, something familiar being twisted to make you question the media we participate in. Throughout the marketing in North America, there was almost no indication that Raiden would be in the majority of the game. This false advertising was important for setting up a much larger discussion, with what is now famously considered as one of the most wild conversations in not only this game, but media as a whole.
Raiden, are you receiving? We're still here.
Now, this may disappoint you, but I actually have nothing to say about this codec conversation. This dialogue has been analysed rigorously by Metal Gear intellectuals on this platform for over a decade, and basically all of them can do a better job of describing the significance of the discussion than I could. Everything I could have spoken about has kind of already been said for me. And if you're also an MG solid super smart guy who frequently reads and listens to methodical breakdowns about this game, then I don't think you need me to regurgitate on the topic.
Do you think you're qualified to decide what's necessary and not?
Absolutely.
After Raiden survives that hell, he has a big DBZ fight with Solidus, and the game ends with him wondering what to do with his new freedom.
Who am I, really?
A lot to unpack. A masterpiece that broke players' expectations and reached further beyond what could be expected from a video game. But this isn't a unanimous understanding despite what critics will tell you. Obviously there are multiple ways you can perceive something, but even today there are still people who don't fully believe in the game's themes, or that the tube folks have supposedly been overanalyzing a basic military game for easy internet clout. As one of the 4 people that posted Hatena Satena content this year, it's fair to say that wide appeal isn't my highest priority. I couldn't give a single Pinocchio about this clout stuff, because I already knows what's up. In this case, I've been thinking about this kind of discussion around Metal Gear Solid 2 for a while now. There are dozens of hour-long essays with in-depth analysis on the themes and arguments the game presents, but those specific topics are not the purpose of this video. What I want to answer is... why? Why does this game attract so much critical discussion? Because it's real, bro.
Listen to me. We're all born with an expiration date. No one lasts forever.
Metal Gear Solid 2 has been labelled as a defining example of postmodern storytelling in video games. The general idea of this design philosophy is that it rejects modern tropes found in electronic media. For Solid 2's case, this has been achieved on many perspectives. The narrative itself conveys that the experience is a recreation of the Shadow Moses incident to simulate day-to-day life, but when translating this objective into reality for the players behind the screen, the game begins to project a potential worldview with its relatable negatives, and a worrisome solution in the form of AI control. A world where a majority of the population would have their information curated, and by extension their free will, as they're deemed impulsive and clogging the rate of evolution, with fake news, smear campaigns, and reactionary politics. There was a rather important book published in the late 40s, 1984 by George Orwell depicted a less futuristic but equally terrifying future where dialogue and truth were twisted and manipulated by the government. A world where even basic math equations were purposely false, birthing a consensus reality where the citizens' spoon-fed thoughts become real information, and any opposition is severely punished. When taking this all in, Solid 2's narrative themes do allude to a rather Orwellian-style future. If you can agree with this, then here's my next question for you. Should a masterpiece replicate the same principles for a different medium? To make a masterpiece is to create something of outstanding quality, but can something be outstanding if its premise is largely lifted from an existing work? I've watched and read dozens of reviews praising this particular AI speech towards the end of the game, as I and many others have compared these predictions to their real-life counterparts. This collection of forecasts isn't unique to Metal Gear though. There are plenty of examples that have attempted to recreate this apocalyptic Judgment Day scenario, both in marketing their media behind half-truths and shattering the fourth wall while doing so. So, what makes Solid 2 any different? The fact that this narrative is presented in the form of a video game? That structuring the game as a virtual simulation is inherently a perfect example for showcasing the potential of this dystopian future? I don't believe the form of art should dictate how well executed a concept is. While it is true that video games are theoretically capable of providing a more interactive experience in portraying these narratives, not even MGS2's plot fully commits to this opportunity. The most impactful revelations shown here are told within the confines of very limited text boxes. It's contextual, but not visually stimulating, unless you'd prefer to make the dispute that depicting the AI's argument within the game's codec is a perfect thematic fit due to them both being computer-related, and even that aspect is hardly unique. I just got done talking about Satana Satana and why I thought that game was arguably a perfect extension of nonogram puzzles, whilst utilising the benefits of the electronic medium, and became something more than a sum of its parts to encourage a high level of logical gameplay. Slapping Picross onto a computer or console doesn't inherently make the puzzle any more masterful than it was previously. It's everything else that's included and woven together for something truly authentic. To put it simply, I don't think Metal Gear Solid 2 is inherently a masterpiece or magnum opus or some other synonym for best thingy, just because it revolves around postmodernism. There are plenty of games that share these aspects. Maybe by your definition, all the games I'm showing on screen are masterpieces, and that's okay. According to YouTube, every good game is a masterpiece. But personally, I think the best games should be put on these podiums because they've peaked in a particular attribute. So, if I don't believe that AI speech, false advertising, or postmodernism is the best attribute about this game, then what is? I think the best thing about this game is all of you, the players. During the ending of the game, Snake says that whatever you choose will be you, and I think that can be translated into the game's ultimate perspective.
Listen, don't obsess over words so much. Find the meaning behind the words, then decide. You can find your own name. And your own future.
Decide for myself?
And whatever you choose will be you.
Raiden will always be Raiden, no matter how much you want him to be another character. And by extension, the player will always be themselves, no matter what others think of that. To give Metal Gear Solid 2 its most literal assessment would be the acknowledgement that Metal Gear Solid 2 is in fact Metal Gear Solid 2. Where am I going with this? People will always try to shape reality in their favour, but they will always still be themselves. As early as Metal Gear 2, this series has been endeavouring further and further to create an authentic military experience, attempting to achieve this with an extraordinary amount of detail. It will always be nothing more than a Man 6 video game, and yet, throughout the years, thousands are willing to contemplate on this series up to its big PS2 stealth 'em up, saying that it predicted the future, or created melon physics, and there's something very human about that. I don't want to get too caught up on human history, but we apparently have a habit of recording information and aiming to apply it in a beneficial context. Multiple types of documentation even appear at the opening cinema. This is fitting for the upcoming themes of misinformation in the media, but possibly even more fitting for this series as a whole. With the sheer volume of military and philosophical content this franchise has contained over the years, perhaps these video games or even art itself could be considered as another form of information. If that's true, then humanity's intentions of using these sources to validate their own selection of perspectives would be incredibly appropriate. After all, the internet has been stockpiling nuanced discussion of this game for over 2 decades now, self-perpetuating intellectual debates on the nature of our world and what we are. This constant desire to understand our surroundings and to apply those perspectives we've learnt, even if they derive from fictional resources. But as I've previously stated, Having a theme alone doesn't constitute such ingenious dialogue, and humanitarianism isn't exactly a new concept, but it does pair remarkably well with everything else I've discussed so far. This franchise's history might be the basis that allows its generous messaging of legacy to hit home harder than any other media, evolving from a small, slightly innovative offbeat maze game to attempting to capture a military-grade experience, emphasizing interactive realism in both the game's items and its environments, to a big blockbuster hit, with next-generation cinematic visuals and audio matched with crushing battle-torn tales criticizing the nature of war and its irreversible effects on the soldiers that lived past those horrors. And Solid 2 bringing all these themes to an unforgettable metaphysical climax. This was a series that always tried to one-up itself with each new entry, pushing to become more complex and continuing the thread of intricate, flavorful gameplay and story. Even as technology advanced, the games debatably represented the peak of their console's technical prowess. These Metal Gears kept turning, and collectively culminated in an experience that has been conversed for literal console generations. The games have earned a legacy throughout their history unlike any other fictional series. It's Metal Gear Solid 2 that rounds it all out with its final, most notable element. My stance here is relatively simple. To create a postmodern narrative, you would need a basis in one reality. After all, it can't be postmodern if there's no modernity to criticize with. At that point, it's just post. The genius of Metal Gear Solid 2 is that it uses a fictional basis in modern reality. A metaphysical mechanical loophole, or a Metal Gear. The developers of this series have created their own legacy with the first 3 games, and then responded to it with Solid 2. They responded to gamers' excitement for the new entry by falsely advertising that Snake would be the main protagonist. They responded to Snake's popularity by creating a personification of the player. They responded to Solid 1's success by replicating the Shadow Moses gameplay structure. Even the codec has been drastically twisted by distorting a previous ally, with malevolent artificial intelligence mimicking the Warlord from the very first game. The Patriot, the S3 Plan, and then there's Solidus, the Suckman himself. A character created to serve as a vessel to take back the player's liberty. He may not have as much authority as the masked puppeteers, or as formidable as the legendary soldier his or the protagonist's genes were constructed from, and yet he was still a meaningful opponent in your journey, as he represents both sides despite ironically being against those old chumps. Solidus was the former US president who worked directly under the Patriots, and the supposed ultimate big boss, which his octopus flamethrowers don't deny. As the player character, you face him, not for putting an end to a family tree dilemma, not for appeasing the AI, but for your own freedom, and to become true to yourself. Metal Gear Solid 2 is able to authentically address a collection of complicated political and metaphysical topics about human nature, thanks to the existence of its own fictional reality that accurately responds to the advanced dilemmas that were brought up across the years, to have a history to back it up.
Through speech, music, literature, and movies, what we've seen, heard, felt, anger, joy, and sorrow. These are the things I will pass on. That's what I live for. We need to pass the torch and let our children read our messy and sad history by its light. We have all the magic of the digital age to do that with. The human race will probably come to an end sometime, and new species may rule over this planet. Earth may not be forever.
And by the end of it all, the game passes its own torch, and encourages players that they have the liberty to make their own legacy. And in some small way, they have. Hundreds of dissertations online expressing the viewpoints of each individual passionate video game player, what they've learned from their experience, and sharing it with the rest of the world. There's only one way to describe that. Doggedly Bonza. The Metal Gear franchise would continue to experiment with complex themes. Will we ever get another groundbreaking game in the same vein as Solid 2 from this series? Maybe we already have, depending on who you ask. Recently these games have been removed from digital storefronts, which is a shame since they're easily some of the most influential games of the medium. For now we'll just have to stay vigilant and hold on to our physical discs, preferably while they're still available. Don't forget about those online servers too. This was easily the most confusing, complicated video I'll ever make, at least until I get around to Chrono Cross. That said, I implore you to have a happy new year.
What are you laughing at?
Do you know what day it is today?
April 30th?
Wait, what do you mean it's April? Okay, I've got nothing else. Goodbye.